Level 1. The Invisible Anchor. What you're about to hear will change how you see every interaction, every purchase, every decision you think you're making freely. These aren't theories or opinions. They're the documented mechanics of your own mind, patterns so reliable that entire industries are built on exploiting them. Let's begin with the one that shapes everything else. Right now, there's a number in your head that you didn't choose, controlling what you're willing to pay, what salary you'll accept, even how you judge whether something is fair. Psychologists call it anchoring, the brain's tendency to latch onto the first piece of information it receives and use that as the reference point for all subsequent judgments. In a famous study by Kahneman and Tversky, participants watched a wheel spin to a random number, then estimated what percentage of African nations belonged to the United Nations. Those who saw the wheel land on 65 guessed around 45%. Those who saw it land on 10 guessed around 25%. The wheel was completely irrelevant to the question, yet it shaped their answers anyway. This is happening to you constantly. The first price you see becomes normal. The first offer in a negotiation becomes the center of gravity. The first impression of a person becomes the lens through which you interpret everything they do afterward. The anchor drops before you even know you're in the water. Level 2. The Spotlight Illusion. You're walking into a room, and you're certain everyone notices the stain on your shirt, the awkward way you said hello, the extra weight you've gained since they last saw you. This feeling is so vivid, so immediate, that it seems obviously true. It isn't. Psychologists at Cornell conducted an experiment where they made students wear embarrassing t-shirts, bright yellow with Barry Manilow's face on the front, then walk into a room full of peers. The students wearing the shirts estimated that about half the room had noticed. When researchers asked the other students what they remembered, fewer than 20% had registered the shirt at all. This is the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias where you drastically overestimate how much attention others pay to your appearance and behavior. The evolutionary logic is almost cruel. Your brain is wired to assume you're being watched, because for most of human history, social judgment meant survival or exile. But in practice, everyone else is too busy worrying about their own imaginary spotlight to notice yours. The anxiety you feel about being perceived is largely a conversation you're having with yourself, projected onto an audience that doesn't exist. Level 3. The Familiarity Trap. There's a song you hated the first time you heard it. By the 5th time, it was tolerable. By the 20th, you found yourself humming it in the shower. This isn't your taste evolving. It's a phenomenon called the mere exposure effect, first documented by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. Simply encountering something repeatedly makes you like it more, regardless of its actual quality. The effect operates below conscious awareness. In one study, researchers flashed Chinese characters on a screen so quickly that the participants couldn't consciously perceive them, just 4 milliseconds per image. Later, when shown those same characters alongside new ones and asked which they preferred, participants consistently chose the ones they'd been exposed to, despite having no memory of seeing them. This is why advertising works even when you're not paying attention. This is why the familiar candidate often wins the election. This is why you trust brands you recognize over objectively superior alternatives. Your brain interprets fluency, the ease with which it processes something, as a signal of safety and truth. Repetition feels like reality. Level 4. The Availability Delusion. You're more afraid of sharks than stairs. though stairs kill about 1,000 Americans per year while sharks kill roughly 1. You worry about plane crashes while casually texting at highway speeds, even though your car is statistically far more dangerous. This isn't irrationality. It's the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut where your brain judges probability based on how easily examples come to mind. Dramatic, emotional, heavily publicized events are stored more vividly in memory, which makes them feel more common than they actually are. Meanwhile, mundane risks that kill steadily but quietly, heart disease, falling in the bathtub, antibiotic-resistant infections, feel abstract precisely because they lack narrative punch. Your fear response evolved to protect you from predators and enemies, threats that came with teeth and claws and clear visual signatures. It never adapted to statistics. This means the news you consume literally reshapes your perception of danger. Every sensationalized story deposits another vivid image in your memory, and your brain counts those images as data points. You end up optimizing for the wrong risks while ignoring the ones that will actually get you. Level 5. The confirmation machine. You already believe your objective. That belief is the first symptom. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm what you already think, while simultaneously dismissing or forgetting evidence that contradicts it. The effect isn't subtle. In a classic experiment, researchers showed participants the same mixed evidence about the death penalty's effectiveness as a crime deterrent. Those who supported capital punishment walked away more convinced it worked. Those who opposed it walked away more convinced it didn't. Same data, opposite conclusions, each group certain they had simply followed the facts. This happens because your beliefs aren't just intellectual positions. They're tied to your identity, your tribe, your sense of being a reasonable person. Contradictory evidence doesn't just threaten an opinion, it threatens your self-concept. So your brain protects you by filtering reality before you can consciously evaluate it. The algorithm in your social media feed didn't invent this problem. It simply automated and accelerated a bias that was already running in your head. Level 6. The halo you don't see. Attractive defendants receive lighter prison sentences. Taller candidates win more elections. People assume that good-looking individuals are also smarter, kinder, and more competent, despite having no evidence for any of it. This is the halo effect, a cognitive bias where one positive trait bleeds into your assessment of everything else about a person. The phenomenon was named by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920, after he noticed that military officers who rated a soldier as physically impressive also rated that same soldier as more intelligent and more trustworthy, even when those judgments were supposed to be independent. Your brain craves coherence. It wants people to be consistently good or consistently bad, because mixed profiles are cognitively expensive to maintain. So, when you see someone beautiful, your mind fills in the rest of the picture to match, and you never notice you're doing it. The reverse is equally true. One negative trait can cast a shadow over everything. The first thing people learn about you often becomes the color through which they see everything else. Level 7. The paradox of choice. More options should make you happier. They don't. In a now famous study at a grocery store, researchers set up a tasting booth with jam. On some days, they displayed 24 varieties. On others, just 6. The larger display attracted more people. But here's what matters. Shoppers who saw 6 options were 10 times more likely to actually buy a jar than those who faced 24. Psychologist Barry Schwartz called this choice overload. When options multiply, the cognitive cost of evaluating them grows exponentially. You become paralyzed, afraid of making the wrong decision, unable to commit, and if you do choose, you're more likely to feel regret afterward, because with so many alternatives, surely one of them was better. This is why restaurants with enormous menus leave you less satisfied than those with curated selections. This is why online dating, with its infinite scroll of potential partners, often produces more anxiety than connection. Your brain didn't evolve to navigate unlimited possibility. It evolved for environments where options were scarce and decisions were final. Abundance, paradoxically, becomes its own kind of poverty. Level 8, the open loop. There's a task you didn't finish, maybe years ago, and it still surfaces in your mind at unexpected moments. A conversation that ended badly. A project you abandoned. A question you never answered. This isn't random mental noise. It's the Zeigarnik effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who noticed in the 1920s that waiters could remember complex orders only until the bill was paid. Then the information vanished. Incomplete tasks create what she called psychic tension, a kind of cognitive bookmark that keeps the unfinished business active in working memory. Your brain treats closure like a filing system. Once something is done, it can be archived and forgotten. But open loops demand attention, cycling back into consciousness until they're resolved. This is why cliffhangers work, why you can't stop thinking about someone who ghosted you, why you remember the one exam question you couldn't answer more vividly than the 99 you got right. Unfinished stories are neurologically stickier than finished ones. The mind hates an open loop. Level 9. The frequency illusion. You buy a new car, let's say a silver Honda Civic, and suddenly silver Honda Civics are everywhere. They're in every parking lot, on every highway, waiting at every intersection. It feels like the world has changed. It hasn't. You've changed. This is the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, sometimes called the frequency illusion. Once something enters your attention, your brain's reticular activating system begins flagging it as relevant, pulling it from the background noise into conscious awareness. The civics were always there. You just weren't counting them. The effect extends far beyond cars. Learn a new word, and you'll hear it 3 times the next week. Start thinking about having children, and suddenly everyone seems pregnant. Begin researching a medical symptom, and cases will appear to surround you. Your perception isn't a passive recording of reality. It's an active filtering process, shaped by what you've primed yourself to notice. The world you see is the world you're looking for. Level 10. The weight of loss. Imagine I offered you a coin flip. Heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $100. Mathematically, it's perfectly fair. Psychologically, it's not even close. Most people refuse the bet because losing $100 feels roughly twice as painful as winning 100 feels good. This asymmetry is called loss aversion, and it's one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky documented it in the 1970s, but the instinct is far older. An evolutionary echo from when resources were scarce and a loss could mean death. Your brain treats potential losses as threats, triggering the same neural circuits that respond to physical danger. This is why people hold losing stocks too long, hoping to break even rather than accepting the loss. Why we stay in bad relationships because leaving feels like losing something, even if what we'd lose is making us miserable. Why limited time offers work. They reframe inaction as loss. The pain of giving something up will almost always outweigh the pleasure of getting something equivalent. Your mind is not a neutral accountant. It's a loss prevention system with a built-in bias toward fear. Level 11. The invisible middle. The movie theater knows something you don't. When they price a small popcorn at $4, a medium at $7, and a large at $7.50, they're not trying to sell you the medium. The medium exists to make the large look like a bargain. This is the decoy effect, a pricing strategy built on the discovery that introducing a third, inferior option changes how you evaluate the other two. Economist Dan Ariely demonstrated this with subscription offers. When The Economist listed a web-only subscription for $59 and a print plus web subscription for $125, most people chose the cheaper option. But when they added a print-only subscription, also at $125, suddenly the print plus web deal looked like a steal, and the majority switched to it. The decoy was never meant to be chosen. It was meant to make the target option look rational by comparison. Your brain doesn't evaluate things in absolute terms. It evaluates them relative to whatever else is in the frame. Control the frame, control the choice. Level 12. The labor illusion. You trust the locksmith who takes 30 minutes more than the one who opens your door in 30 seconds, even though the fast one is objectively more skilled. You value the meal that took hours to prepare over the one that arrived instantly, even if they taste identical. This is the IKEA effect's darker cousin, a cognitive bias where visible effort increases perceived value, regardless of actual results. Researchers at Harvard found that people rated identical search results as more valuable when the website displayed a loading animation suggesting the computer was working hard to find them. The waiting was fake. The satisfaction was real. Your brain uses effort as a proxy for worth because, for most of human history, that correlation held true. Difficult things were rare. Rare things were valuable. But in a world where technology can deliver excellence instantly, this heuristic misfires. You end up paying more for the appearance of labor than for the quality of the outcome. Level 13. The Ownership Delusion. The mug you own is worth more to you than an identical mug you don't own, not because of any objective difference, but simply because it's yours. This is the endowment effect, first documented by economist Richard Thaler. In experiments, people who were given a mug demanded roughly twice as much to sell it as others were willing to pay to buy it. Ownership itself created value that didn't exist before. The effect explains why you keep clothes you never wear, books you'll never read, and subscriptions you barely use. The moment something becomes yours, your brain reassesses its worth upward, and giving it up starts to feel like a loss. Marketers exploit this ruthlessly. Free trials. Take it home and try it. 30-day money-back guarantees. They know that once the product enters your possession, your psychological attachment will make returning it feel like amputation. You're not evaluating the object anymore. You're defending territory. Level 14. The planning lie. You will finish this project late. Not because you're lazy or incompetent, but because you're human, and humans are systematically incapable of accurately predicting how long things will take. The planning fallacy, identified by Kahneman and Tversky, shows that people consistently underestimate completion times even when they have direct experience with similar tasks running over schedule. In one study, students predicted they'd finish their thesis an average of 34 days before the deadline. The actual average completion time was 7 days before, a 27-day error. The strangest part? When asked to predict how long other students would take, the estimates were far more accurate. You can see others clearly. You're blind to yourself. The bias persists because you plan based on best-case scenarios rather than base rates. You imagine the ideal timeline and discount the obstacles, the interruptions, the motivation dips. Your optimism about your own future is a kind of low-grade delusion that feels like confidence. Level 15. The Immortality Myth. You know, intellectually, that bad things happen to people. You just don't really believe they'll happen to you. This is optimism bias, the tendency to overestimate your likelihood of positive outcomes and underestimate your vulnerability to negative ones. Smokers acknowledge that cigarettes cause cancer, while rating their personal risk as lower than other smokers. Drivers admit that accidents happen while believing they're better than average behind the wheel, a statistical impossibility when 90% of people claim to be above average. Neuroscientist Tali Sharot found that when people received good news about their future, say a lower than expected risk of disease, their brains updated their beliefs accordingly. But when they received bad news, the update was significantly smaller. Your brain literally resists negative information about yourself. This isn't delusion in the clinical sense. It's a feature. Moderate optimism bias correlates with better mental health, higher motivation, and longer life. The lie keeps you moving, but it also keeps you underinsured, underprepared, and convinced that the rules apply to everyone except you. Level 16. The Confidence Trap. The people who know the least are often the most certain they know everything. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect, named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who documented a brutal irony of human cognition. Incompetence robs you of the very skills needed to recognize your incompetence. In their studies, participants who scored in the bottom quartile on tests of logic and grammar estimated their performance to be above average. Meanwhile, top performers consistently underestimated their abilities. The effect isn't about stupidity, it's about the relationship between knowledge and self-assessment. When you know very little about a subject, you can't see how much you're missing. The map looks complete because you haven't discovered the territories that aren't on it. Expertise, paradoxically, reveals the vastness of what remains unknown, which is why the most knowledgeable people often speak with the most caveats. Certainty is frequently a symptom of ignorance dressed as confidence. Level 17. The Horoscope Hook. You read a personality description, and it resonates so deeply that it feels like it was written specifically for you. It wasn't. It was written to apply to almost everyone. This is the Barnum effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum, who allegedly said there's a sucker born every minute. Psychologist Bertram Forer demonstrated the phenomenon in 1948 by giving students a personalized personality assessment, then asking them to rate its accuracy. The average rating was 4.2 out of 5. What Forer didn't tell them until afterward: every student received the exact same paragraph, compiled from newspaper horoscopes. Statements like, "You have a tendency to be critical of yourself," or "You have a great deal of unused capacity which you have not turned to your advantage," feel personal because they're universally true. The Barnum effect is the engine behind astrology, cold reading, and most personality quizzes. You're not being seen. You're being mirrored with deliberately vague glass. Level 18. The Frame Game. A medical procedure with a 90% survival rate feels safer than one with a 10% mortality rate, even though they're describing the exact same odds. This is the framing effect, and it demonstrates that the words wrapped around information change how your brain processes the information itself. Kahneman and Tversky found that people chose differently when options were framed as gains versus losses, even when the underlying math was identical. 72% of participants approved a policy framed as saving 200 lives out of 600. Only 22% approved when the same policy was framed as 400 people will die. Your brain doesn't compute pure probabilities. It responds to the emotional valence of how those probabilities are presented. Politicians know this. Advertisers know this. 95% fat-free sells better than contains 5% fat. The frame isn't decoration around the facts. The frame is the message. Level 19. The Sunk Cost Spiral. You're an hour into a terrible movie, and you keep watching. Not because it might get better, but because you've already invested an hour. You stay in a career that makes you miserable because you've already invested a decade. You finish the meal you don't want because you already paid for it. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the irrational tendency to let past investments dictate future decisions, even when those investments are irretrievable and irrelevant to what comes next. Economists call costs sunk when they cannot be recovered regardless of what you do now. Rationally, only future costs and benefits should matter. But your brain hates waste. It treats abandoning a sunk cost as admitting a mistake, and admitting mistakes threatens your self-image as a competent decision-maker. So you double down. You throw good time after bad time, good money after bad money, good years after bad years, all to avoid the psychological pain of cutting your losses. The past becomes a prison built from the fear of having been wrong. Level 20. The Herd Horizon. You're standing on a street corner and you see 3 people staring up at the sky. Within seconds, you're looking up too, searching for whatever they're seeing, even though you have no information suggesting there's anything there. This is the bandwagon effect, social proof in its most primal form. Psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated its power in the 1950s, when Confederates in an experiment deliberately gave wrong answers to simple visual questions. Roughly 75% of participants conformed at least once, choosing an answer they could plainly see was incorrect because everyone else had chosen it. The instinct isn't weakness, it's evolutionary wisdom. For most of human history, the crowd often did know something you didn't. Where the predator was, where the food was, which path was safe. But in a world of manufactured consensus, bot armies, and curated social feeds, the signal has been corrupted. Viral doesn't mean true. Popular doesn't mean good. The herd can walk off a cliff together, each member assuming the others must know where they're going. Level 21. The Highlight Reel. You remember your vacation as better than it actually was. The delayed flights, the food poisoning, the argument on day 3, these have faded, while the sunset on the beach and the laughter at dinner remain vivid. This is the peak-end rule, discovered by Daniel Kahneman. Your brain doesn't average an experience. It samples the most intense moment and the final moment, then constructs a memory from those 2 data points. In one study, participants immersed their hands in painfully cold water for 60 seconds. Another group endured the same 60 seconds, plus an additional 30 seconds where the water was slightly warmed. Still uncomfortable, but less so. When asked which trial they'd repeat, most chose the longer one. More total pain, but a better ending. The implications are everywhere. A terrible meal can be redeemed by an exceptional dessert. A good relationship can be poisoned by a bad breakup. Your brain isn't recording your life. It's editing it in post-production, and the editor has very specific preferences. Level 22. The Echo of Now. The last thing you heard carries more weight than everything that came before it. This is recency bias, the tendency to overweight recent information when making judgments, simply because it's more available in working memory. Investors sell stocks after a market dip, forgetting decades of long-term gains. Managers evaluate employees based on the past few weeks rather than the past year. Jurors are disproportionately influenced by closing arguments, regardless of what the evidence actually showed. In studies of sequential decision-making, the order in which information is presented dramatically affects outcomes. Identical candidates are evaluated differently, depending on whether their strongest qualities appear at the beginning or end of an interview. The bias exists because your brain prioritizes what's fresh. Evolutionarily, recent information was usually more relevant to immediate survival than distant information. But in complex modern decisions, this shortcut distorts judgment. The last data point isn't more true, it's just more present. Your entire assessment of a person, a company, or a situation can pivot on the most recent fragment of information, overwriting months or years of accumulated evidence. If you want to influence someone's opinion, speak last. If you want to make better decisions yourself, deliberately recall what you knew before the latest headline arrived. Level 23. The Comparison Trap. The $50 bottle of wine tastes better after you've sampled the $10 bottle. Not because the wine changed, but because your reference point did. This is the contrast effect. The brain evaluates things not in isolation, but against whatever was just experienced. Real estate agents know this instinctively. They show you the overpriced, slightly run-down property first. Then they show you the house they actually want to sell. Suddenly, the second house seems like a revelation. Spacious, well-maintained, reasonably priced. Even if you would have found it ordinary without the comparison. The same principle explains why stores place expensive items at eye level, with cheaper alternatives below. So you encounter the premium option first, making everything else feel like a deal. Salary negotiations follow the same pattern. The first number spoken anchors the discussion, and every subsequent offer is judged as a gain or loss relative to that anchor. Your perception of value is never absolute. It's always relative to the frame that was established moments before. Two identical objects can feel completely different depending on the sequence in which you encountered them. Control the sequence. Control the judgment. Level 24. The Suffering Premium. The fraternity you hazed to join means more to you than the club that simply accepted your application. The degree you sacrificed years for feels more valuable than the one you could have earned online in 6 months. This is effort justification, a cognitive bias where the difficulty of obtaining something inflates its perceived worth. The classic study comes from social psychologists Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills in 1959. Women who endured an embarrassing initiation to join a discussion group rated the group as more interesting and valuable than women who joined without the initiation, even though everyone attended the exact same boring discussion. Your brain needs the suffering to have meant something. To admit that you endured pain for something mediocre would create unbearable cognitive dissonance. So instead, you elevate the reward to match the cost. This is why cults use harsh initiations, why elite institutions maintain unnecessary barriers, and why you defend the things you struggled for long after the evidence suggests you shouldn't. Level 25. The Pratfall Paradox. The perfect person makes you uncomfortable. The person who spills coffee on themselves while being otherwise brilliant. Them you like. This is the Pratfall Effect, documented by Elliot Aronson in 1966. In his experiment, participants listened to recordings of a student answering quiz questions. When a highly competent student was heard knocking over a cup of coffee, his likability increased. But when an average student made the same blunder, his likability decreased. The finding reveals something counterintuitive about human connection. Flawlessness is alienating. Competence establishes respect, but vulnerability establishes relatability. When someone who appears to have it all together reveals a crack, it makes them human. Someone like you, someone approachable. The Pratfall effect only works, though, if the foundation of competence is already established. Weakness without strength is just weakness. Strength without weakness is intimidating. The combination of both is magnetic, which is why the most persuasive leaders and the most beloved public figures have always understood the strategic value of a well-timed imperfection. Pause here for a moment. Let these patterns settle into place. You've just moved through 25 mechanisms that shape your perception without your permission. Anchors that set your expectations. Spotlights that don't exist. Familiarity masquerading as truth. Effort inflating value. And comparisons that warp reality. Notice what you're already seeing differently. The prices that suddenly look like traps. The confidence that now sounds like ignorance. The choices that feel less free than they did an hour ago. This isn't about cynicism. It's about clarity. What comes next shifts from observation to tactics. How these patterns are used, deliberately, to move you. Stay with me. Level 26. The gift that binds. You didn't ask for the free sample, the complimentary coffee, the address labels that arrived in the mail from a charity you've never heard of. But now you have them. And now you feel something. A subtle pressure, an obligation, a debt you didn't agree to incur. This is reciprocity, one of the most powerful forces in human social behavior, and it operates whether you consent to it or not. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss documented it across cultures. The giving of gifts creates bonds of obligation that the receiver cannot easily escape. Robert Cialdini's research confirmed the mechanism in modern settings. When a waiter brings a mint with the check, tips increase. When a solicitor gives you a flower before asking for a donation, compliance rates surge. The reciprocity rule doesn't care that the gift was unsolicited. It doesn't care that the request that follows is disproportionate to what was given. Your brain registers the imbalance and demands it be corrected. You were in equilibrium. Now you owe something. The only way out is to pay. With money, with attention, with a yes you didn't want to give. Level 27. The Manufactured Consensus. 5 stars. 4,000 reviews. Bestseller. Most popular. You trust these signals because they represent the collective judgment of people like you. Strangers who have already done the research, tested the product, validated the choice. Except, increasingly, they don't. Social proof, the psychological tendency to look to others for guidance in uncertain situations, has been industrialized. Fake reviews are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Bot farms manufacture engagement. Bestseller lists can be gamed by purchasing patterns designed to trigger algorithmic promotion rather than reflect genuine popularity. The original function of social proof was sound. If 100 people chose this path and survived, the path is probably safe. But the signal has been corrupted. The crowd you're following may not exist. The consensus you're deferring to may have been purchased by the very people who benefit from your compliance. In a world of manufactured agreement, looking to others for answers may be the fastest way to be deceived. Level 28. The panic button. Only 2 left in stock. Sale ends in 3 hours. Limited time offer. You feel something shift in your body. A tightening, an urgency, a fear that you're about to miss out on something you weren't even sure you wanted 5 seconds ago. This is artificial scarcity, and it works by hijacking loss aversion. Your brain's tendency to weigh potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains. Researchers have demonstrated that identical items become more desirable when they're described as rare or soon to be unavailable. The cookies in a jar taste better when there are only 2 left than when there are 10. The opportunity feels more valuable when the window is closing. Marketers know this, which is why countdown timers and low stock warnings are ubiquitous in e-commerce. Most of the scarcity is fabricated. The urgency is artificial, but your amygdala doesn't know that. It responds to the threat of loss with the same physiological cascade it would use for a predator. And in that state, you don't think. You grab. Level 29. The white coat effect. A man in a lab coat tells you to administer an electric shock to a stranger. The stranger screams. The man in the lab coat tells you to continue. You continue. This isn't hypothetical. It's Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments from the 1960s, among the most disturbing studies in the history of psychology. 65% of participants delivered what they believed were potentially lethal shocks, simply because an authority figure in a position of apparent expertise told them to proceed. Authority bias is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy and moral legitimacy to figures who display markers of authority. Titles, uniforms, credentials, confident demeanor. The bias evolved because, in most situations, deferring to those with more knowledge is efficient and wise. But the same mechanism that helps you trust your doctor also makes you vulnerable to anyone who wears the costume of authority. Experts say. Doctors recommend. Studies show. These phrases bypass your critical faculties not because of what follows, but because of who appears to be speaking. Level 30. The mirror connection. You like people who are like you, who share your background, your values, your taste in music, your way of speaking. This isn't shallow, it's neurological. The brain processes similarity as a signal of tribal membership, and tribal membership means safety. Salespeople and negotiators exploit this ruthlessly through a technique called mirroring, subtly adopting your posture, your speech patterns, your vocabulary, to create an unconscious sense of rapport. Robert Cialdini identified liking as one of the 6 fundamental principles of influence. We are dramatically more likely to say yes to people we feel connected to, even if that connection is entirely manufactured. The car salesman who mentions he's also from your hometown, the interviewer who laughs at exactly the same moments you do, the colleague who suddenly shares your exact opinion on a controversial topic. These may be genuine coincidences. They may be strategic performances. Your brain often can't tell the difference, which is precisely the point. Level 31. The tribe card. We. That single word changes everything. When a speaker shifts from you to we, they're invoking shared identity, a tribe, a family, a movement that includes both of you on the same side of an invisible line. Robert Cialdini called this the unity principle, and it operates at a level deeper than mere similarity. Unity isn't about liking someone who shares your interests. It's about feeling that someone is part of your fundamental group, your people. Politicians deploy it constantly. We, the people. Our nation. Together we can. Brands manufacture it by creating communities rather than customer bases, members rather than subscribers. The power of unity is that it triggers identity-protective cognition. Once you feel that someone is part of us, criticism of them feels like criticism of yourself. Their victories become your victories. Their enemies become your enemies. The boundary between self and group blurs, and suddenly you're defending positions you never consciously adopted, simply because they came from inside the circle. Level 32. The foot in the door. They don't ask for much at first. Just a signature on a petition. Just a small donation. Just 5 minutes of your time. And because the request is small, you agree. It would be awkward to refuse something so trivial. What you don't realize is that you've just changed. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift of self-perception. You are now the kind of person who supports this cause, who gives to this charity, who participates. And when they return with a larger request, you'll agree to that too, because refusing would be inconsistent with who you've just proven yourself to be. This is the foot-in-the-door technique, first documented by psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in 1966. In their study, homeowners who first agreed to display a small sign were far more likely to later accept a large, ugly billboard on their lawn than those who were approached with the billboard directly. The initial compliance wasn't just a favor, it was an identity commitment. Each yes makes the next yes easier, and the manipulator knows exactly how to sequence the asks. Level 33. The Retreat Gambit. They ask for something outrageous, a request so large, so unreasonable, that you have no choice but to refuse. Then they retreat, offering something smaller, more moderate, almost humble by comparison. And suddenly, you're saying yes. This is the door-in-the-face technique, and it weaponizes two biases simultaneously. First, the contrast effect. The smaller request feels trivial compared to the anchor of the large one. Second, reciprocal concession. When someone backs down from a position, social norms pressure you to match their retreat with a concession of your own. In Cialdini's research, participants who first refused to chaperone juvenile delinquents on a 2-year weekly commitment were 3 times more likely to agree to a single zoo trip than those who were only asked about the zoo trip. The manipulator never expected you to say yes to the large request. It was bait, designed to make the real request feel reasonable, and to make your eventual compliance feel like a negotiated compromise rather than a surrender. Level 34. The magic word. There's a word that short-circuits resistance. Ellen Langer discovered it in a study so simple it almost seems trivial. Researchers approached people waiting to use a copy machine and asked to cut in line. When they said, "Excuse me, may I use the machine?" compliance was 60%. When they added a reason, "Because I'm in a rush," compliance jumped to 94%. But here's the strange part. When they offered a meaningless reason, "Because I have to make copies," compliance was still 93%. The reason itself didn't matter. What mattered was the word because. The human brain is wired to accept requests more readily when they come with any explanation, even a circular one. We want reasons. We need the form of justification, even when the content is empty. This is why effective persuaders always explain, even when the explanation adds nothing. The word because is a key that opens doors the request alone cannot. Level 35. The Bonus Blitz. But wait, there's more. The infomercial catchphrase is built on a specific psychological mechanism called the "that's not all" technique. Unlike the door in the face, which starts high and retreats, this approach starts with an offer and then sweetens it before you have time to decide. A product is presented at a certain price. Then, before you can form a judgment, bonus items are added. Free shipping, an extra accessory, a second one at no charge. Psychologist Jerry Berger demonstrated the effect in experiments where participants were offered a cupcake for 75 cents. For some, 2 cookies were added before they could respond. Those who received the improved offer were far more likely to buy than those who simply saw the full deal from the start. The technique works because the additions feel like gifts, triggering reciprocity, while also preventing you from anchoring on a no. You're being rushed into gratitude before you can complete a rational evaluation. The deal is getting better in real time. How could you possibly walk away? Level 36. The Favor Paradox. Here's something counterintuitive. Asking someone for a favor makes them like you more, not less. This is the Ben Franklin effect, named after the founding father who discovered it by accident. Franklin had a political rival who refused to speak to him. Instead of trying to win the man over with kindness, Franklin asked to borrow a rare book from the rival's library. The man agreed. Franklin returned it with a gracious note, and from that point forward, the rival became a friend. The psychology behind this is cognitive dissonance. When someone does you a favor, their brain needs to justify the effort. The easiest justification is that they must like you. Why else would they help? The act of giving creates a narrative of connection that didn't exist before. This inverts the common assumption that you should do favors to win people over. Sometimes, the more effective strategy is to let others do something for you. You're not just receiving help, you're giving them a reason to care about you. Level 37. The Flattery Algorithm. You know when someone is flattering you. The compliment is too convenient, too aligned with what they want from you, too smooth, and yet it still works. Research by social psychologist Elliot Aronson found that flattery increases liking even when the recipient is fully aware that the flatterer has ulterior motives. The effect diminishes slightly when the manipulation is obvious, but it doesn't disappear. Your brain wants to believe the nice things people say about you, even when your rational mind knows better. This is why ingratiation remains one of the most common influence tactics in professional settings, because it's low cost, low risk, and effective even when transparent. The person complimenting your presentation before asking for a deadline extension isn't fooling you, but they're still shifting your emotional state in their favor, creating a micro debt of goodwill that makes refusal feel slightly ruder than it would otherwise. You can see the strings and still dance. Level 38. The Body Echo. Within minutes of meeting someone who makes you comfortable, you'll start to match their posture. You'll cross your legs when they cross theirs, lean forward when they lean in, mirror the rhythm of their speech without noticing you're doing it. This is called limbic synchrony, and it's one of the brain's primary mechanisms for establishing rapport. When we mirror someone's body language, we're signaling at a pre-verbal level. I am like you. I am safe. We are in this together. The effect is powerful enough that it can be deliberately deployed. Trained negotiators, therapists, and salespeople learn to mirror strategically, matching posture, breathing rate, even blinking patterns, to accelerate trust. Studies show that waiters who repeat customers' orders back verbatim receive higher tips than those who paraphrase. The echo itself communicates understanding. You may think you're being read. In reality, you're being reflected, and the reflection feels like connection. Level 39. The Future You. Imagine yourself 6 months from now, waking up in your new home, sunlight streaming through the windows, your family gathered in the kitchen you designed together. This isn't description. It's a technique called future pacing, and it's standard practice in high-end sales, therapy, and political messaging. By guiding someone to visualize a specific positive future, one that includes the product, the decision, the vote. You're not just persuading their logical mind. You're creating an emotional memory of something that hasn't happened yet. Neuroscience confirms that the brain processes vividly imagined scenarios using some of the same circuits as actual memories. When you mentally rehearse a future, you're laying down neural pathways that make that future feel familiar, even inevitable. The car salesman who asks you to picture yourself driving down the coast isn't making small talk. He's installing a preview of ownership in your imagination, and once it's there, not buying starts to feel like losing something you already had. Level 40. The Face That Moves You. One child starving on a poster raises more money than 1 million children described in a statistic. This is the identifiable victim effect, the reliable finding that people respond with far more empathy and generosity to a single, named, visible individual than to abstract numbers, no matter how large. Mother Teresa reportedly said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." She was describing human psychology, not prescribing it. Researchers have found that donations to a named child decrease when statistical information about the larger crisis is added alongside. The abstraction actually reduces compassion. Your brain evolved to care about faces, not data. A single story with a name and eyes and a specific tragedy activates empathy circuits that spreadsheets cannot reach. This is why charities lead with individuals, why news anchors personalize disasters, and why your attention is drawn to the one anecdote even when it contradicts 1,000 data points. Statistics inform the mind. Faces move the heart. Level 41. The Point System. You've earned 200 points. You're 3 badges away from gold status. Your streak is at 14 days. Don't break it now. This is gamification, the application of game design elements to non-game contexts, and it's engineered to exploit the same dopamine pathways that make video games compulsive. Points, levels, progress bars, and achievements create a sense of advancement that feels meaningful even when it isn't. Your brain doesn't distinguish well between arbitrary progress and real progress. It just wants to see the numbers go up. Apps use this to keep you engaged long past the point of genuine value. Loyalty programs use it to make switching costs feel higher than they are. Educational platforms use it to make learning feel like winning, which sounds positive until you realize that optimizing for streaks isn't the same as optimizing for understanding. You're not playing the game. The game is playing your reward circuits, and the house always wins. Level 42. The Outrage Machine. The algorithm knows something about you. You can't look away from things that make you angry. Social media platforms are not designed to inform you or connect you. They're designed to capture and hold your attention, and nothing captures attention like outrage. Studies have found that content triggering moral indignation spreads faster and farther than any other type. Each angry share, each furious comment, trains the algorithm to serve you more of the same. The result is a feedback loop where your emotional temperature is deliberately elevated because engagement is the product. You are not the customer of these platforms. You are the inventory, and your attention is being sold to advertisers. The outrage you feel is real, but the selection of what you're outraged about is curated by machines optimizing for clicks, not truth. You leave each session more certain that the world is terrible, more convinced that the other side is evil, and less capable of the nuanced thought that might actually help you change anything. Level 43. The slot machine in your pocket. You pull your phone from your pocket, check for notifications, find nothing new, and put it back. 30 seconds later, you do it again. This behavior isn't weakness. It's the predictable result of variable ratio reinforcement, the same schedule of rewards that makes slot machines the most addictive form of gambling. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain enters a state of heightened anticipation, releasing dopamine not when the reward arrives, but in the moments of uncertainty before. Every notification might be important, so every check carries the neurological signature of potential payoff. App designers understand this intimately. They randomize notification timing, batch alerts to create intermittent bursts, and design interfaces that require repeated engagement to extract value. The pull to refresh gesture is a lever. The red notification badge is a cherry on a slot reel. You're not distracted because you lack discipline. You're distracted because some of the smartest engineers in the world have optimized every pixel on your screen to exploit a vulnerability in human attention that's millions of years old. Level 44. The unpredictable reward. Consistency is comforting but forgettable. Unpredictability is stressful but addictive. This is the core mechanism behind intermittent reinforcement, and it explains phenomena far beyond apps and slot machines. It explains why inconsistent parenting can create more attachment-seeking behavior in children, why the friend who sometimes texts back and sometimes ghosts. You occupies more of your mental real estate than the one who's reliably available. Why toxic relationships, with their cycles of affection and withdrawal, create bonds that feel impossible to break. When rewards are reliable, the brain adjusts and takes them for granted. When they're unpredictable, it stays vigilant, constantly scanning for patterns, never fully relaxing into certainty. This vigilance feels like importance. It feels like intensity. Often, it's mistaken for love. The unpredictable reward doesn't just capture attention, it hijacks the brain's learning systems, convincing it that this thing, this person, this app, this game, must be figured out, must be monitored, must never be let go. Level 45. The Countdown Panic. This offer expires in 4:59:32. The timer is ticking. You can see the seconds drain away, each one representing a window closing, an opportunity dying, a future in which you'll regret hesitation. This is artificial urgency, and it works because your brain processes time scarcity the same way it processes resource scarcity. The countdown timer isn't informational, it's emotional. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, triggering a mild fight-or-flight response that narrows focus and suppresses deliberation. Under time pressure, people make faster decisions with less information, exactly the conditions that favor impulsive purchases over considered ones. Most of these deadlines are fake. The sale will return. The limited offer will be extended. But your amygdala doesn't know that, and by the time your prefrontal cortex catches up, your credit card number is already entered. The urgency wasn't a fact about the world. It was a weapon deployed against your capacity to think clearly. Level 46. The Dark Pattern Maze. You wanted to unsubscribe, but the button was hidden. The process required 17 clicks, and somewhere along the way you gave up. This wasn't bad design. It was intentional design. Dark patterns are user interface choices deliberately crafted to trick you into actions you didn't intend. Signing up for newsletters, accepting privacy invasions, continuing subscriptions you meant to cancel. The confirm shaming button that says, "No, I don't want to save money." The pre-checked box buried in a wall of text. The account deletion process that requires calling a phone number during business hours. These aren't accidents or oversights. They're strategic deployments of friction, designed by people who understand that every additional step between a user and their goal creates a percentage who will abandon the attempt. The path toward what benefits the company is always smooth. The path toward what benefits you is always obstructed. You're navigating an environment that has been deliberately architected against your interests. Level 47. The $0 Trap. Free isn't just a price. It's a different psychological category entirely. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely demonstrated this with a simple experiment. When offered a Lindt truffle for 15 cents or a Hershey's Kiss for 1 cent, most people chose the truffle, the better deal by any rational measure. But when both prices dropped by 1 cent, truffle for 14 cents, kiss for free, the preference flipped dramatically. The kiss became irresistible. The word free triggers a response that transcends rational calculation. It eliminates the pain of paying entirely, creating a sensation closer to gaining something than to purchasing it. This is why free shipping increases conversion rates even when the shipping cost has been folded into the product price. Why free trials convert at rates that far exceed discounted ones. Why you'll stand in line for a free sample you wouldn't have paid a quarter for. Free doesn't mean zero cost. It means zero friction. And in the landscape of human decision-making, friction is everything. Level 48. The Nines Effect. There's a reason prices end in 99 cents. It's not tradition. It's not aesthetics. It's because your brain processes $2.99 as closer to $2 than to $3, even though you know perfectly well the difference is a single penny. This is charm pricing, and it exploits a cognitive shortcut called left-digit anchoring. Your brain gives disproportionate weight to the leftmost digit when evaluating numbers quickly. Research has shown that items priced at $39 sell significantly better than items priced at $34 if the more expensive option is reduced from $44. Because the drop from a 4 to a 3 in the tens place feels like a larger discount than it is. The reverse also works for prestige. Luxury brands often price at round numbers, $200 instead of $199, because the rounded figure signals quality rather than bargain hunting. Every price you encounter has been engineered. The number isn't a fact about value. It's a communication strategy, designed to make you feel something specific about the transaction before your rational mind can intervene. Level 49. The Disorientation Zone. There are no windows in casinos, no clocks on the walls. The carpet patterns are ugly on purpose, designed to keep your eyes on the machines rather than the floor. You entered through a deliberately confusing layout, passed by restaurants and shops, and now you're not entirely sure how to leave. This is the Gruen transfer, named after architect Victor Gruen, who designed the first enclosed shopping mall. The phenomenon describes the moment when a purposeful shopper becomes an aimless wanderer, disoriented by intentional design choices that suppress the sense of time passing, destination seeking, and rational priority. Malls, airports, and casinos all use it. IKEA's winding one-way path is the most famous retail example. You came for a lamp and left 3 hours later with a cart full of items you encountered because leaving wasn't easy. The environment isn't neutral. It's a machine for altering your state of consciousness, making you more susceptible to impulse, more likely to lose track of the you who walked in with a plan. Level 50. The missing out that wasn't. You scroll through photos of a party you weren't invited to. You see friends at a concert, colleagues at a dinner, strangers on a beach at sunset. Something tightens in your chest. A cocktail of envy, loneliness, and regret for choices you didn't make. This is FOMO, the fear of missing out, and social media has industrialized it. What you're feeling isn't a response to missing actual experiences. It's a response to missing curated highlights, the best moments, the best angles, the best versions of lives that are just as ordinary and anxious as your own when the camera is off. Studies have shown that increased social media use correlates with increased FOMO, and increased FOMO correlates with decreased life satisfaction and increased anxiety. The fear is manufactured. The missing out is an illusion. You're comparing your full experience, the boring parts, the quiet parts, the sitting alone on the couch parts, to everyone else's highlight reel, and concluding that you're the one doing life wrong. You're not. You're just seeing a lie presented as a window. Pause here. Breathe. You've traveled from the basic architecture of bias through the deliberate tactics used to exploit it. The gifts that obligate, the scarcity that panics, the algorithms that inflame, the designs that disorient. You now see the machinery behind what used to feel like free choice. What comes next is different. We move inward, toward the truths we don't tell ourselves, the patterns we don't want to see, the parts of this that implicate not just the manipulators, but us. This isn't about fear. It's about acceptance. Stay with me. You've spent the last 50 levels learning how the world works on you. The biases hardwired into perception. The techniques deployed by those who've studied those biases. The systems designed to capture your attention and steer your behavior. If you've been paying attention, some of this might feel uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too right. Because somewhere in the description of the manipulation, you recognized yourself, not just as the target, but as the practitioner. This is the turn. What follows isn't about dark psychology done to you by shadowy forces. It's about the darkness that runs through all of us, the ways we deceive ourselves, the manipulation we practice on the people we love, often without knowing it, the uncomfortable truth that the line between victim and perpetrator isn't as clear as we'd like it to be. This section may feel heavier. Some of these levels will land in places you'd rather not look. That's intentional, not to cause harm, but because genuine understanding requires it. You cannot protect yourself from patterns you refuse to see, and you cannot grow past behaviors you refuse to acknowledge. But here's what matters. None of this makes you broken. These patterns exist because they're human. Every single one of them served a function once: protection, connection, survival. They were strategies your younger self developed to navigate a world that felt threatening or confusing. The child who learned to manipulate was often a child who had no other power. The adult who deceives themselves is usually protecting a wound too painful to examine directly. The goal isn't to judge yourself for having these patterns, it's to see them clearly, so they stop running your life from the shadows. Awareness doesn't erase the past, but it changes the future. It gives you something you didn't have before, a choice. What comes next is about acceptance. Not passive acceptance that lets harmful patterns continue, but the kind of acceptance that precedes change. The honest look in the mirror that makes transformation possible. This is the work that matters. This is the part that sets you free. Stay with this. You're doing something important. Level 51. The Manipulator in the Mirror. Here's something nobody wants to admit. You manipulate people. Not occasionally, not accidentally. Regularly and strategically, often without conscious awareness. When you phrase a request to maximize the chance of agreement, that's manipulation. When you emphasize certain facts and omit others to shape someone's perception, that's manipulation. When you adjust your tone, your expression, your word choice based on what you think will work on this particular person, that's manipulation. The word carries a dark connotation, but the behavior is universal. Persuasion, influence, social navigation. These are just polite names for the same underlying process. Attempting to alter another person's thoughts or actions to align with your preferences. The difference between healthy influence and toxic manipulation isn't the presence of the behavior. It's the degree of deception, the respect for the other person's autonomy, and the willingness to accept no. You've been on both sides of this line. Accepting that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you an honest one. Level 52. The Unreliable Narrator. Your memory of your childhood isn't accurate. Neither is your memory of last week. The brain doesn't record experiences like a video camera. It reconstructs them each time you remember, filling gaps with plausible details, smoothing inconsistencies, updating the narrative to fit your current identity. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades demonstrating how easily memories can be implanted, distorted, or entirely fabricated, and how confidently people defend memories that never happened. In one study, researchers convinced a significant percentage of participants that they had been lost in a shopping mall as children, complete with vivid details they themselves generated. The memory felt absolutely real. This means the story you tell about your life, the formative experiences, the turning points, the villains and heroes, is at least partially fiction. Not lies exactly, just the best reconstruction your brain could manage with incomplete data and motivated reasoning. You are the unreliable narrator of your own existence, and you'll never know which parts you got wrong. Level 53. The Stranger Behind Your Eyes. You made a decision today. You think you know why. You're probably wrong. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's famous experiments showed that brain activity predicting a decision occurs several hundred milliseconds before a person consciously decides to act. The conscious mind isn't the CEO. It's the press secretary, receiving memos about decisions already made and then crafting explanations that sound rational. Psychologists call this confabulation, the generation of plausible but fabricated explanations for our own behavior. When split-brain patients are shown evidence of actions taken by the disconnected half of their brain, they instantly invent reasons for behavior they couldn't possibly understand. The rest of us do the same thing constantly, just less dramatically. You don't actually know why you chose that partner, that career, that political position. You know the story you tell yourself, the narrative that makes sense in retrospect. The real causes are deeper, older, and largely inaccessible to introspection. Level 54. The program you didn't write. Your taste in music, your sense of humor, your political instincts, your definition of success. Where did these come from? You experience them as you, authentic expressions of an inner self. But trace them back far enough, and you find parents, peers, algorithms, advertisements, accidents of geography and timing. The philosopher you admire is the one your college professor assigned. The food you crave is what your culture taught you to desire. The life goals you're pursuing were installed before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them critically. This isn't an argument that free will doesn't exist. It's an observation that the will part has boundaries you didn't choose. You're running software written by others, updated by experience, but never fully authored by the conscious self that claims ownership. The implications aren't nihilistic, they're humbling. The preferences you'd die to defend might be preferences you'd never have developed if you'd been born 2,000 miles east or 2 decades earlier. Level 55. The love that moves you. The people who love you most are also the people most invested in managing your behavior. Parents shape children through approval and withdrawal. Partners negotiate identity through feedback loops of validation and critique. Friends maintain bonds partly through mutual influence, encouraging conformity to shared values. This isn't malicious. It's structural. Love creates investment, and investment creates the desire to shape outcomes. When your mother suggests you'd be happier in a different career, she's not just sharing an opinion. She's attempting to alter your trajectory based on her own needs, fears, and projections. When your partner expresses disappointment in a choice you made, the emotional weight of that disappointment is itself a form of pressure. The manipulation that happens in loving relationships isn't evidence that the love is fake. It's evidence that love and influence are inseparable. Every relationship is a negotiation, and the currency is identity. The people who care about you are always, in some sense, trying to make you different than you are. Level 56. The Guilt Machine. Guilt isn't just an emotion. It's a technology of control, and you've been trained to operate it on yourself. Developmental psychologists observe that guilt emerges as children internalize the expectations of caregivers, transforming external rules into internal monitors. The parent no longer needs to be present. The guilt does the surveillance. This serves a social function. It maintains cooperation and discourages defection from group norms. But the system is imprecise. It can be hijacked by manipulators who weaponize your conscience against you. It can malfunction, generating guilt for actions that harmed no one or for boundaries that were entirely reasonable to set. And it can be inherited, handed down from anxious parents who installed a guilt system calibrated to their fears rather than your well-being. The guilt you feel isn't necessarily a signal that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's just evidence that someone, somewhere, once benefited from you feeling bad about this particular type of choice. Level 57. The Outrage You Chose. You believe your anger is a response to injustice, and sometimes it is, but often your outrage is as curated as your social media feed. Selected not because it's the most important issue, but because it's the most emotionally available one. The thing you're furious about today was chosen for you by an algorithm, a news editor, a social network optimizing for engagement. There are 1,000 injustices you could be angry about. You're angry about this one because it was placed in front of you, because it was framed in a way that activated your tribal identity, because the outrage of others made it feel urgent and consensual. This doesn't mean the anger is wrong. The injustice might be real. But the selection process is invisible, and it serves interests that aren't yours. Your emotional life is partly a product of what the attention economy decided to show you this morning. The righteousness you feel is genuine. The reasons you feel it now, about this instead of something else, are manufactured. Level 58. The Accidental Gaslighter. Gaslighting is a term usually reserved for deliberate psychological abuse, the systematic denial of another person's reality to maintain control. But here's an uncomfortable possibility. You've probably done it without meaning to. When you remembered an argument differently than your partner and insisted your version was correct, you may have been gaslighting. When you dismissed someone's emotional reaction as an overreaction because it didn't match your perception of events, that was a form of reality denial. When you said, "That's not what I meant," in a way that made the other person doubt their valid interpretation of your words, you were prioritizing your intent over their experience. None of this makes you an abuser. It makes you human. A human with a flawed memory, a self-serving bias, and a strong preference for being right. The difference between inadvertent gaslighting and the pathological kind is willingness to be wrong. Openness to the possibility that your perception isn't the only valid one. But the behavior itself? Almost everyone has been on both sides of it. Level 59. The Intensity Illusion. The relationship that consumed you. The one with the highest highs and lowest lows. The one you couldn't stop thinking about. The one that felt like destiny or addiction or both. Might not have been love. It might have been trauma bonding. When affection is delivered unpredictably, alternating with withdrawal, criticism, or chaos, the brain enters a state of hypervigilance that feels like passion. The relief of reconnection after conflict triggers dopamine surges that dwarf the steady warmth of stable attachment. You weren't experiencing deeper connection. You were experiencing intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. This doesn't mean the feelings weren't real. They were. But intensity isn't intimacy, and the inability to stop thinking about someone isn't proof of love. It's often proof of anxiety. The calmest relationships, the ones that don't keep you up at night, might be the healthiest. They just don't feel as important, because your nervous system was trained to equate chaos with significance. Level 60. The Weaponized Silence. Withdrawal is violence. Not physical violence, but psychological warfare so effective that it's been classified as a form of emotional abuse when used systematically. The silent treatment, refusing to acknowledge another person's existence, communication, or emotional needs, exploits one of the deepest human fears: abandonment. When someone withdraws affection or responsiveness as punishment, the target experiences pain that activates the same neural circuits as physical injury. Studies using fMRI have shown that social rejection and physical pain share overlapping brain pathways. The silence doesn't just feel like rejection, the brain processes it as a threat to survival. And here's the part that implicates all of us. Most people have done this. Not always consciously, not always maliciously. Sometimes just because you were hurt and wanted the other person to feel it, or because you needed space and didn't know how to ask without punishing. Withdrawal is a weapon. Knowing that doesn't mean you've never used it. It means you can choose not to use it again. Level 61. The Shadow that Points Back. The trait you despise most in others is usually one you haven't integrated in yourself. Carl Jung called this projection, the unconscious transfer of your own unacceptable qualities onto external targets. The coworker whose arrogance infuriates you might be reflecting your own suppressed grandiosity. The friend whose neediness exhausts you might be showing you a dependency you've disowned. This doesn't mean every negative judgment is projection. Some people really are behaving badly, but the intensity of your reaction is diagnostic. When something triggers disproportionate emotion, disgust, rage, contempt, it's worth asking what part of yourself you're seeing in that mirror. The shadow isn't evil. It's just the parts of you that weren't acceptable to the people who raised you, the parts you had to exile to survive your environment. They didn't disappear. They went underground. And now they emerge as inexplicable reactions to strangers who carry the same exiled cargo. What you hate out there often lives in here. Level 62, the Golden Age. That wasn't, the past was not better. Your childhood summers were not actually longer. Music was not objectively superior in whatever decade you romanticize. The feeling that things used to be good and have since declined is called declinism, and it's a near-universal illusion generated by the brain's asymmetric memory storage. Positive experiences become more accessible over time, while negative ones fade, creating a rosy retrospection that paints the past in warmer colors than it deserves. Meanwhile, the present carries the full weight of its inconveniences, anxieties, and unresolved problems. You're comparing a curated highlight reel of yesterday to the unedited raw footage of today. Nostalgia isn't memory, it's a mood, a pleasant ache for something that never quite existed as you remember it. The people living in your golden age were just as convinced that things were getting worse, and they were wrong too. Every generation mourns a paradise that was, in reality, just another complicated present. Level 63. The self you perform. You are not the same person with your parents, your boss, your closest friend, and a stranger at a bus stop. You modulate your vocabulary, your posture, your emotional expressiveness, your opinions, sometimes consciously, often automatically. Sociologist Irving Goffman called this impression management, and his insight was that there is no backstage self, no authentic core that exists independent of performance. All of social life is theater. This doesn't mean you're fake. It means identity is relational, a negotiated space between who you are and who the situation calls for. The self you experience as really you is just the performance you've rehearsed most thoroughly, usually the one developed in childhood with your family of origin. When you say someone finally saw the real you, what you often mean is that they saw a version you rarely perform because most contexts don't permit it. But that version isn't more true than the others. It's just less common. Level 64. The loneliness industry. You're more connected than any human in history, and possibly lonelier than your grandparents ever were. This isn't a paradox. It's a business model. Loneliness creates consumers. The isolated individual purchases substitutes for community. Entertainment, self-help, parasocial relationships with influencers, products that promise belonging without the vulnerability actual relationships require. Social media platforms generate engagement by providing the sensation of connection without its substance. The likes, the comments, the followers, while simultaneously fragmenting attention in ways that make deep presence with another person increasingly difficult. The loneliness epidemic isn't an accident or a side effect. It's structurally profitable. A person embedded in a thick web of genuine relationships needs less, buys less, scrolls less. The anxious, isolated individual is the ideal economic unit. This doesn't mean your loneliness isn't real. It means the environment that produces it was designed by people who benefit from it. Level 65. The success. You fear There's a version of your life where you get everything you say you want: the relationship, the career, the recognition, the freedom. Part of you is working toward it. Another part is terrified of it. This is the fear of success, and it's more common than most people admit. Success changes identity. It removes familiar problems and replaces them with unfamiliar ones. It raises the stakes, increases visibility, and eliminates excuses. Some part of you knows that achieving your stated goals would require becoming a different person. A person who can handle the pressure, the envy, the responsibility. The self-sabotage that keeps you stuck might not be laziness or lack of discipline. It might be a protection mechanism, preserving the current self against the threat of transformation. Wanting something and being ready to have it are not the same. Sometimes you stay small not because you can't grow, but because growth means grieving the version of yourself that's been running the show. Level 66. The judgment that reveals. Pay attention to what you criticize. The colleague you dismiss as a sycophant might represent ambition you've disowned. The friend you mock for being materialistic might embody desires you've judged too shameful to acknowledge. Envy is information, and judgment is its disguise. When you find yourself repeatedly irritated by a specific quality in others, their confidence, their freedom, their ability to receive without guilt, you're often encountering something you want but have forbidden yourself from pursuing. The criticism converts the wanting into contempt, protecting you from the vulnerability of desire. This isn't universal. Sometimes the thing you dislike is simply worth disliking. But when the charge is electric, when you return to the same judgment repeatedly, when you feel almost righteous in your dismissal, that energy is diagnostic. You don't spend that kind of emotional currency on things that don't matter to you. The heat in your judgment often marks the location of your hidden hunger. Level 67. The comfortable prison. You know exactly what you need to change. You've known for years, and yet you stay. Not because you can't leave, but because the pain you know feels safer than the uncertainty you don't. This is the preference for familiar suffering over unfamiliar growth, and it's one of the most human patterns there is. The relationship that doesn't work has at least become predictable. The job that drains you provides a known identity. The habits that harm you are grooves you've worn smooth with repetition. Change means stepping into a void where you don't know who you'll be, where the problems haven't been mapped yet, where you might fail in new and humiliating ways. Your nervous system reads that uncertainty as threat and steers you back to the familiar, even when the familiar is slowly killing you. You're not stuck because you're weak. You're stuck because your brain has evolved to prioritize known dangers over unknown possibilities. The cage door is often open. Fear keeps you from noticing. Level 68. The belief that serves. Your beliefs are less about truth than about function. The political position you hold, the worldview you've adopted, the theory of human nature you subscribe to. These were selected, at least partially, by their utility to your ego and social position. Believing that hard work determines outcomes serves different psychological needs than believing that systems are rigged. Both beliefs might be partially true, but which one you emphasize depends on which one makes your own situation feel more meaningful. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, the tendency to arrive at conclusions you want to reach, then reverse engineer the logic to make the arrival seem inevitable. Your beliefs feel like discoveries. More often, they're constructions, built to protect identity, justify choices, and maintain membership in your tribe. This doesn't make you a liar. It makes you a human. navigating complexity with a brain that cares more about coherence than accuracy. The first step toward clearer thinking is admitting you're not starting from a neutral position. Level 69. The Niceness Mask. People-pleasing looks like kindness, but it's often a form of manipulation. An attempt to control how others perceive you by never showing them anything that might trigger rejection. The chronic people-pleaser isn't generous. They're afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of abandonment. Afraid of the anger that might emerge if they ever said what they actually thought. So they perform agreeableness, saying yes when they mean no, prioritizing others' comfort over their own truth, building relationships on a foundation of inauthenticity. The tragedy is that it doesn't work. The connection people-pleasers crave can never be achieved through performance, because the person being accepted isn't really them. It's the curated, compliant version that exists only to avoid danger. Real intimacy requires the risk of being disliked. It requires the boundary that might cause friction, the honesty that might sting. The people-pleaser trades the possibility of genuine connection for the certainty of superficial approval, and calls the resulting loneliness being nice. Level 70. The Gaslight You Survived. Somewhere in your history, someone made you doubt your own perception. Maybe it was dramatic. A parent who denied saying things you clearly heard. A partner who rewrote events to make you the villain. Or maybe it was subtle. A slow accumulation of small invalidations that taught you to distrust your own judgment. Either way, the residue remains. You second-guess yourself more than you should. You apologize before you've done anything wrong. You feel a flicker of uncertainty every time someone contradicts your memory of shared events. This isn't weakness. It's the predictable consequence of having your reality systematically undermined. The good news is that awareness is the beginning of recovery. You were trained to distrust yourself, but that training can be unlearned. Your perceptions are valid. Your memories, while imperfect, are real. The version of events that serves someone else's interests is not automatically more accurate than your own. You are allowed to trust yourself again, even if it takes time. Level 71. The Closure That Doesn't Come. You're waiting for a resolution that may never arrive. The apology, the explanation, the final conversation that would make sense of what happened. But the brain's need for narrative closure is not a promise that the world will provide one. Some people will leave your life without explaining why. Some relationships will end in ambiguity. Some questions about your own history will remain permanently unanswered. The longing for closure is real, but it's also, in a sense, a trap. A belief that peace can only come from external resolution, from someone else giving you the ending you need. It can't. The closure, if it comes at all, must be constructed internally, through meaning-making that doesn't depend on participation from people who may never participate. This isn't resignation, it's freedom. The alternative is to remain hostage to someone else's willingness to provide what they may not have the capacity or the interest to give. You can close doors from the inside, even when no one else shows up to help. Level 72. The Problem You Need. There's an identity inside your struggle. You are the person who overcomes this particular obstacle, who wrestles with this particular demon, who is defined by this particular wound. And that identity, painful as it is, provides something. Coherence, narrative, a role in your own story. This is why people sometimes unconsciously resist solutions to problems they consciously want to solve. The problem has become load-bearing. Without it, who are you? Recovery, in this light, isn't just relief. It's a kind of death. The self that was constructed around the suffering must be grieved even as the suffering ends. This explains the strange sabotage that happens on the edge of breakthrough, the relapse that follows progress, the return to familiar pain after tasting freedom. Some part of you is loyal to the version of yourself that struggled. Letting go of the problem means letting go of that self. It's not that you want to suffer, it's that you don't yet know who you'll be when you stop. Level 73. The forgiveness that frees you. Forgiveness isn't about them. It was never about them. The person you can't forgive may not know, may not care, may not even remember what they did. Your refusal to forgive doesn't punish them. It only continues to occupy space in your own mind, maintaining a link to the injury, keeping the wound from fully closing. This doesn't mean forgiveness is easy, or that it means condoning what happened, or that it requires reconciliation. It doesn't. Forgiveness is simply the release of the demand that the past be different than it was. An acceptance that frees your attention for something other than ruminating on injury. In this sense, forgiveness is selfish, and that's precisely why it works. You're not doing it for them. You're doing it because resentment is expensive, and you're tired of paying rent on space occupied by someone who isn't worth it. The debt you think they owe you? They were never going to pay it. Forgiveness is writing it off and reclaiming the energy for yourself. Level 74. The Imposter You Are. You're waiting to be found out. Despite evidence of competence, degrees, accomplishments, the trust others place in you, some part of you believes you've fooled everyone, and it's only a matter of time before the mask slips. This is imposter syndrome, and it afflicts an estimated 70% of people at some point in their lives. The feeling that you don't belong, that everyone else knows something you don't, that your success is luck or performance rather than merit. Here's the uncomfortable truth that might set you free. Everyone is performing. The people who seem confident. Many of them are running the same anxious calculations you are, wondering when they'll be exposed. The difference between you and the people who seem to belong is often just the willingness to act as if they do. Competence isn't the absence of self-doubt. It's action despite self-doubt. You're not an imposter. You're just someone who hasn't yet accepted that uncertainty is part of being human, not proof of fraud. Level 75. The Disappearance. You will be forgotten. Not immediately. Some people will remember you for decades, maybe longer if you're lucky, but eventually, the last person who knew you will die, and then the last person who heard stories about you, and then even your name will dissolve into the vast archive of humans who existed and then didn't. This is true for nearly everyone who has ever lived. The pharaohs built pyramids to defeat it and failed. The artists created works hoping to outlast their bodies, and most of those works are gone too. This isn't a tragedy, it's simply the math of time. And strangely, it might be a relief. If nothing you do will last forever, you're free from the tyranny of legacy. You can stop optimizing for an imaginary future audience and start living for the people who are actually here, in this brief window where your existence overlaps with theirs. The disappearance that awaits you isn't a reason to despair. It's permission to stop performing for eternity and start showing up for now. Pause. Let these truths settle. You've just walked through the parts of yourself that prefer to stay hidden. The manipulator, the performer, the prisoner of familiar pain. You've seen the loneliness beneath the connection, the fear beneath the ambition, the wound beneath the identity. None of this was meant to break you. It was meant to free you, because you can only change what you can see. what comes next lifts upward again, toward meaning, toward connection, toward what you do with all of this. The darkness isn't the destination. It's the passage. Stay with me. Level 76. The Crowd Mind. Something happens to you in a crowd. Your sense of individual responsibility diffuses. Your threshold for behavior you'd never consider alone drops significantly. This isn't weakness. It's a documented phenomenon called de-individuation, and it's been observed in lynch mobs and protest marches, stadium riots, and corporate meetings. When personal identity blurs into group identity, the internal monitor that normally governs behavior goes quiet. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo studied this in his famous Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary students became cruel guards within days, enabled by uniforms, roles, and group dynamics that obscured their individual selves. The crowd doesn't make you evil. It makes you anonymous, and anonymity changes what you're willing to do. Every atrocity in history required ordinary people to subsume themselves into something larger. A nation, a movement, a righteous cause. The mob is always composed of individuals who, in isolation, would have made different choices. In the crowd, they become something else. So could you. Level 77. The Fear Lever. Fear is the master key to compliance. A population that is afraid will accept surveillance it would otherwise reject, sacrifice freedoms it would otherwise defend, and follow leaders it would otherwise question. This isn't theory. It's the documented playbook of every authoritarian movement in history. Sociologist Barry Glassner calls it the culture of fear, the systematic amplification of certain threats to maintain a state of chronic anxiety in the population. The threats are often real but misrepresented. Statistically, rare events framed as imminent dangers, complex issues reduced to existential battles, enemies constructed to embody everything the audience already fears. When you're afraid, your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational deliberation, becomes less active. You become more suggestible, more tribal, more willing to defer to authority. Your fear is not irrational, but the selection, framing, and amplification of what you fear is almost always strategic. Someone benefits from your anxiety, and it's rarely you. Level 78. The Immunity Illusion. You believe you're too smart for propaganda. That belief is the propaganda working. The most effective influence doesn't feel like influence. It feels like your own conclusion, arrived at independently through rational consideration. Studies consistently show that people who believe they're immune to advertising are actually more susceptible, because their confidence prevents them from engaging the critical scrutiny that might protect them. Propaganda doesn't announce itself. It arrives as news, as entertainment, as common sense, as the obvious position that all reasonable people hold. The moment you think only idiots fall for this, you've lowered your defenses against whatever sophisticated version is currently shaping your own worldview. Everyone is susceptible. The difference is whether you know it. Intellectual humility isn't just a virtue. It's a defensive posture. The certainty that you see clearly is often the sign that someone has successfully obscured your vision. Level 79. The Firehose Effect. There was a time when propaganda meant hiding the truth. Now it often means drowning the truth in noise. The fire hose of falsehood is a modern technique that abandons the effort to be believed in favor of overwhelming the audience's capacity to know anything at all. Contradictory claims, rapid pivots, endless controversies, manufactured debates. The goal isn't to convince you of a particular lie, but to exhaust your ability to distinguish truth from fiction. When everything is contested, nothing is certain. When the volume of information exceeds your capacity to process it, you retreat into tribal heuristics or disengage entirely. Both outcomes serve those who benefit from confusion. Disinformation researchers note that this technique is particularly effective in democracies, where public consensus is necessary for collective action. If consensus becomes impossible, so does coordinated response. The flood isn't meant to make you believe. It's meant to make belief itself feel naive. Level 80, the manufactured grass. The protest looked organic. Thousands of people, homemade signs, authentic outrage. Except it wasn't. Astroturfing is the practice of creating the appearance of grassroots support for a position that is actually funded and coordinated by hidden interests. The term comes from astroturf, the artificial grass. It looks real, but it's manufactured. In the digital age, this has scaled dramatically. Bot networks amplify hashtags. Paid commenters flood forums with coordinated talking points. Think tanks produce research that reaches predetermined conclusions. The goal is to exploit social proof, the bias you learned about earlier, by simulating a consensus that doesn't exist. When you see everyone talking about something, you assume it reflects genuine public interest. Often, you are watching a performance funded by someone with a very specific agenda. The grassroots you think you're joining might be astroturf, and the people who planted it are counting on you not checking. Level 81. The Story Prison. You live inside narratives you didn't choose. The story of your nation, your culture, your family. These arrived before you, shaped how you interpret events, defined what counts as success and failure, heroes and villains. Narratives are invisible precisely because they feel like reality rather than interpretation. The fish doesn't see the water. The most powerful narratives aren't the ones you know you're telling yourself. They're the ones that structure your perception before you can question them. This is why changing someone's mind about facts rarely changes their behavior. The facts are interpreted through a narrative lens that determines their meaning. To shift someone's worldview, you don't argue about data points. You offer a different story. The implications cut both ways. Your own deepest convictions might be artifacts of narratives installed so early that you can't distinguish them from truth. The story feels like reality. It isn't. It's just the first story you were told. Level 82. The window moves. There was a time when certain ideas were unthinkable, so far outside the range of acceptable discourse that even mentioning them marked you as extreme. Then, gradually, they became thinkable, then acceptable, then popular, then policy. This is the Overton window, named after policy analyst Joseph Overton, and it describes the range of ideas considered politically acceptable at any given moment. The window isn't fixed. It shifts over time, usually through sustained effort by advocates who initially seem radical. Today's moderate position was often yesterday's fringe position that moved into the mainstream through repetition, normalization, and strategic framing. The implications are uncomfortable in both directions. Ideas you consider obviously correct were once considered obviously insane, and ideas you consider obviously insane might someday be consensus. You're not standing on solid ground. You're standing on a window that's always in motion, and the forces moving it are not always visible to you. Level 83. The Panic Pattern. It starts with something genuinely concerning. A crime, a trend, a new technology, a subculture. Then the concern is amplified, concentrated, repeated until the thing becomes a symbol of everything threatening about the modern world. This is a moral panic, and societies generate them regularly, often following remarkably similar scripts. Sociologist Stanley Cohen identified the pattern in the 1960s. A threat is identified, media amplifies it, moral entrepreneurs call for action, authorities respond, and eventually the panic subsides, often leaving behind laws, institutions, or stigmas that outlast the original concern. Satanic ritual abuse, video game violence, stranger danger. These panics felt urgent and obvious while they were happening. In retrospect, the threat was often exaggerated, the response disproportionate, and the real beneficiaries were those who gained power or ratings from the fear. The next panic is coming, and it will feel just as urgent as all the others. It will also, probably, follow the same script. Level 84. The Hypnosis of the Mass. Under certain conditions, large portions of a population can enter a state that resembles hypnosis, a narrowing of attention, a willingness to follow a single narrative, a reduced capacity for critical thinking, and an intolerance of dissenting views. Psychiatrist Matthias Desmet calls this mass formation, and he argues it emerges when four conditions are present: widespread social isolation, a sense that life lacks meaning, high levels of free-floating anxiety, and high levels of free-floating frustration. When these conditions are met, a population becomes vulnerable to any narrative that offers an explanation for the anxiety and a target for the frustration. The relief of having an answer, even a false one, is so powerful that people will defend the narrative against all evidence, because abandoning it would mean returning to the unbearable state of meaningless anxiety. The mass isn't stupid. It's in pain, and the narrative is an anesthetic. Understanding this doesn't make you immune, but it might make you recognize the symptoms when they appear in yourself. Level 85. The Spiral of Silence. You are in a room where everyone seems to agree on something you doubt. You say nothing. You assume your doubt is rare, perhaps even shameful. Meanwhile, half the room is having the same experience. Silent, isolated, each believing they're the only one who disagrees. This is the spiral of silence, identified by political scientist Elizabeth Noel Neumann. When people perceive that their opinion is in the minority, they become less likely to express it, which makes the minority seem even smaller, which further discourages expression. The spiral continues until the perceived minority view virtually disappears from public discourse, not because people stopped holding it, but because they stopped saying it. The implications for understanding public opinion are significant. What appears to be consensus is often just the loudest voices assuming they speak for everyone. The silent majority isn't always a myth. Sometimes it's an entire population, silenced by the perception of isolation, waiting for someone to say what everyone is already thinking. Level 86. The Confusion Strategy. When the truth is inconvenient, the goal isn't always to replace it with a lie. Sometimes it's simply to generate confusion, to create enough noise, enough competing narratives, enough uncertainty that people disengage from trying to know anything at all. Political strategists call this the chaos dividend, the profit extracted when a population is too overwhelmed to organize coherent opposition. If no one can agree on basic facts, coordinated action becomes impossible. If expertise itself is discredited, any claim becomes as valid as any other. The confusion isn't failure, it's success, for those who benefit when the public is paralyzed. Recognizing this changes how you interpret certain patterns of information. The endless controversy, the rapid cycling of scandals, the feeling that the ground beneath you keeps shifting. Sometimes these are genuine complexities in a complicated world. Sometimes they're manufactured disorientation, designed to keep you from standing firm on anything long enough to act. Level 87. The Attention Heist. Your attention is the most valuable resource you own, and you're being robbed constantly. Every notification, every scroll, every interruption is a hand in your cognitive pocket, extracting the one thing you can never get back: the present moment. Former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris has called this the race to the bottom of the brainstem, a competition among platforms and apps to capture your attention using techniques drawn from neuroscience, gambling, and behavioral psychology. The stakes are enormous. Attention determines what you think about, which shapes who you become. The person you are in 10 years is built from the moments you inhabit between now and then. If those moments are hijacked by feeds optimized for engagement rather than well-being, you're not living your life. You're living a life designed for someone else's profit. The heist happens so gradually, so constantly, that you don't feel the loss, until you notice that hours have disappeared, and you can't quite remember what you did with them. Level 88. The Tribal Lock. You didn't reason your way into your tribe. You were born into it, or fell into it through circumstance, and then your brain built a fortress around the membership. Tribalism isn't a bug in human cognition. It's a feature, a survival mechanism that bound early humans into cooperative groups capable of defending against threats no individual could face alone. But the mechanism doesn't distinguish between legitimate threats and manufactured ones, between tribes formed around genuine shared values and tribes formed around marketable identities. Once you're in, the machinery activates. Us versus them. In-group favoritism. Out-group derogation. Motivated reasoning in defense of tribal narratives. You don't evaluate your tribe's claims. You defend them. The other tribe isn't just wrong. They're the enemy. This wiring is running in almost everyone, including you. The question isn't whether you're tribal. You are. The question is whether you can see the tribalism clearly enough to prevent it from running your life. Level 89. The Leader, Hunger. When uncertainty rises, so does the appetite for someone who seems certain. This is the strongman appeal, and it emerges from a real psychological need. The human brain craves resolution, especially in anxious times. A leader who projects absolute confidence offers relief from the burden of ambiguity. They provide clear enemies, simple explanations, decisive action, the fact that the confidence is often unfounded, the enemies constructed, and the explanations false doesn't diminish the appeal. It enhances it. Uncertainty is painful. Certainty feels like safety. Authoritarian movements throughout history have exploited this dynamic, rising in periods of economic stress, social upheaval, or perceived threat. The followers aren't stupid, they're anxious, and they've found someone who offers the psychological equivalent of a painkiller. Understanding this won't make you immune, but it might help you recognize when your own hunger for certainty is making you susceptible to those who supply it without earning it. Level 90. The System's Immune Response. Try to change a system and watch how it resists. Institutions, corporations, governments. They develop self-preservation mechanisms that have nothing to do with their stated missions. The school exists to educate, but the school's bureaucracy exists to perpetuate the bureaucracy. The company exists to serve customers, but the company's culture exists to protect itself from disruption. This isn't malicious, it's structural. Systems that don't develop self-preservation mechanisms get replaced by systems that do. Evolution applies to organizations as surely as it applies to organisms. The implication is that reform is never as simple as having a better idea. Better ideas must navigate the immune response of the system they threaten, and that immune response has been optimized over time to neutralize threats to continuity. The idealist with a vision tends to underestimate this. Systems aren't waiting to be improved. They're waiting to defend themselves against anyone who tries. Level 91. The Cynicism Trap. After everything you've learned, the biases, the manipulation, the systems designed to exploit you, it would be reasonable to conclude that nothing can be trusted and nothing can change. This response is understandable. It's also exactly what certain interests want from you. Cynicism is not the same as wisdom. It masquerades as sophistication, but it's actually a form of surrender. The decision to stop trying because trying is naive. The cynic believes they've seen through the illusion, but they've often just exchanged one form of passivity for another. Instead of being manipulated into compliance, they're manipulated into disengagement. The system doesn't need you to believe its lies. It just needs you to believe that resistance is futile. Healthy skepticism preserves your critical faculties without abandoning the possibility of action. Cynicism is giving up and calling it clarity. The fact that you can be fooled doesn't mean everything is foolishness. It means you need to be careful, not paralyzed. Level 92. The Simulation Question. Here's a thought experiment that some physicists take seriously. The odds that you're living in a base reality, rather than a simulation running on some future civilization's computer, might be surprisingly low. The argument, articulated by philosopher Nick Bostrom, goes like this. If it's possible to create realistic simulations of consciousness, and if civilizations tend to create many such simulations, then most conscious beings would exist inside simulations rather than outside them. You'd be in the majority by being simulated. This isn't provable, and it might not matter. If the simulation is indistinguishable from reality, what would change if you knew? The question does something useful, though. It loosens the grip of certainty, reminds you that your assumptions about the nature of existence might be wrong in ways you can't detect. That's not a reason to despair. It's an invitation to humility, and perhaps to the recognition that even in a simulation, your experience, your relationships, and your choices would remain real to you. Level 93. The Death Awakening. Awareness of mortality changes everything. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pischinsky, proposes that much of human behavior is driven by the unconscious attempt to manage the awareness that we will die. We build cultures, belief systems, and legacies to create a sense of symbolic immortality, something that will outlast our physical bodies. We cling to groups that promise transcendence. We attack out groups that threaten our meaning systems, because those meaning systems are the psychological walls protecting us from the terror of annihilation. This sounds grim, but it has a liberating corollary. Conscious confrontation with death can reduce the unconscious terror. When you look directly at mortality, not as an abstraction, but as your personal destination, you often find that the fear diminishes and something else emerges. Clarity about what actually matters. Urgency about the time you have. Freedom from trivial concerns that consume people who haven't yet made peace with the end. Level 94. The Meaning Factory. Here's a secret that could either terrify you or set you free. Meaning is not found. It's made. The universe doesn't come pre-labeled with purpose. It's silent on the question of what your life is supposed to be about. This was the central insight of existentialist philosophy, articulated most powerfully by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. For some, this is devastating. If meaning isn't inherent, isn't everything just arbitrary? But there's another way to read it. If meaning isn't handed down, you're not obligated to accept meanings that don't fit. You're the author. The absence of cosmic assignment isn't emptiness, it's freedom. You get to decide what matters. You get to construct a purpose that resonates with who you actually are, rather than contorting yourself to fit a script written before you existed. The responsibility is heavy. The freedom is immense. Meaning is a creative act. You are the artist. Level 95. The Connection Shield. Here is something that actually works. Genuine human connection is the single most robust defense against manipulation, despair, and the erosion of self. People embedded in healthy relationships, real presence, real vulnerability, real mutual support, are harder to manipulate because they don't need what the manipulator is selling: belonging, validation, certainty. They already have it. Loneliness makes you vulnerable. Connection makes you resilient. The research is overwhelming. Loneliness correlates with earlier death, poorer immune function, and increased susceptibility to conspiracy thinking and extremism. Connection correlates with health, happiness, and a stable sense of self that can withstand uncertainty. This doesn't mean you need dozens of friends. A few genuine connections is enough. But it means the time you invest in building and maintaining real relationships isn't just pleasant. It's protective. In a world designed to isolate and exploit you, connection is an act of resistance. Level 96. The Trick Revealed. Seeing the trick doesn't make you immune to it, but it changes everything anyway. Once you understand anchoring, you can pause before the first number and ask what the real value is. Once you see social proof, you can question whether the crowd actually knows something or is just following itself in circles. Once you recognize intermittent reinforcement, you can name the craving for what it is: a design choice, not a need. Knowledge isn't a magic shield, but it is a weapon. The manipulations that worked on you in the dark work less well in the light. The biases that ran your life unconsciously have less power when you can see them running. You'll still be influenced. You're human, and these mechanisms are deep. But you'll be influenced less automatically, with more friction, with more moments of choice. The trick is only a trick if you don't see it coming. Now you see. Level 97. The Resilience. You forgot. You've survived everything that has happened to you so far. Every manipulation, every heartbreak, every system designed to exploit you. You're still here. That's not nothing. It's easy, in cataloging all the ways you've been fooled and used, to lose sight of this basic fact. You've been navigating a world full of traps since birth, and you've made it through. Not unscathed, maybe, but present, thinking, learning. The brain that fell for these tricks is the same brain that's now understanding them. The vulnerability that made you a target is the same vulnerability that allows you to connect, to feel, to change. You're not as fragile as this catalog of manipulations might suggest. You're actually remarkably durable. The fact that you can be hurt doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're alive. And being alive, despite everything, is something to respect. Level 98. The Plastic Brain. The brain you have right now is not the brain you have to keep. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience, isn't just real, it's lifelong. The patterns that were installed in childhood can be modified. The habits that feel automatic can be interrupted. The reactions that seem hardwired can, with practice, be redirected. This doesn't mean change is easy. Neural pathways worn deep by repetition resist alteration. But it means change is possible. Meditation has been shown to physically alter brain structure in ways that reduce reactivity and increase emotional regulation. Therapy changes the brain. Exercise changes the brain. Even the simple act of paying attention differently, choosing where your awareness goes, changes the brain. You are not fixed. The wiring that shaped your responses can be rewired. The person you are now is not the person you have to be. Level 99. The Compound Effect. One small choice doesn't matter much. 100 small choices in the same direction change everything. This is the compound effect, the principle that tiny, consistent actions accumulate into massive transformations over time. It's the same mechanism that makes manipulation so effective. Small commitments snowball into large ones, but it works in reverse too. One moment of awareness won't save you. 1,000 moments of awareness will rewire how you see. One genuine conversation won't cure loneliness. A pattern of genuine conversations will rebuild connection. One refusal to be baited won't free you from outrage. A habit of pausing before reacting will gradually return your emotional sovereignty. You don't have to overhaul your life in a single dramatic gesture. You just have to make the next small choice a little more consciously than the last one. The compound interest of awareness is freedom. Level 100. The Awakening. You're not the person you were 100 levels ago. Something has shifted. Not because you've learned information, but because you've seen yourself in it. The biases aren't abstractions anymore. They're your biases, running in your mind, shaping your choices. The manipulation isn't something that happens to other people. It's the water you swim in, and now you know it's wet. This awareness doesn't fix everything. It doesn't make you immune to influence or perfectly rational or free from the patterns that shaped you. But it gives you something you didn't have before. A gap between stimulus and response, a moment of choice where before there was only reaction. That gap is freedom. Not absolute freedom. No one has that. But enough freedom to matter. Enough to choose differently. Enough to build a life that isn't simply the output of forces you never saw. You came here to fall asleep. But in another sense, you're waking up. The trick was always the same. Keep you unconscious of the machinery. You've seen the machinery now. What you do with that seeing is up to you. And for the first time, it actually is up to you.